So let's jump and talk about Madison within the Mormon context.
All
So
right.
let's go back to around 7 years old, reaching 8. I guess let's begin. How did you handle baptism with Madison?
Well, part of that may have come from a bit of my theological training.
Was this an existential crisis for you, having a child with disabilities? Was it shocking? Did you pray to try and did you have him blessed with priesthood blessings to try and have him fixed? Like, how did your religiosity affect those early years of how you looked at and coped with and experienced, these experiences with Madison?
Very good question. We were probably so busy that we couldn't get into some of those things in a way.
So the why me and why God and
Right.
that didn't.
Well, I think at 2 a.m. on some nights, everybody kind of says, why me and why this situation? Why Madison? I think is a much more important question to me.
Yeah.
Why did it happen to me? It's not me. It's Madison that may be experiencing life differently than I perceived he should experience life. Now, we can get into a lot of other things about that, but as far as the religious nature of things, I think we have had a way of looking at different types of things and a different type of expectation in a way that things happen. There are things in the course of creation that happen. And rather than going, woe is me, it's more, what do we do about this? More into kind of a problem solving mode. And that seemed to be healthy for our family. The hard parts were some of these milestones, and you talk about baptism. The theological training that I had put a great seriousness on so many of the things that were milestones in the general Christian community. And even though usually it isn't baptism at age 8, there are other types of things and people taking on responsibilities and commitments. We didn't see with Madison that he could really understand some of the things that we felt were core for him to go through that type of a commitment. Because I do picture baptism as a commitment. I remember the day I was baptized, and my mother said something to the point of, you're now responsible for and accountable when I do ask you to do something. It was kind of like you had a free ride. I'd correct you, but, things are a little bit different now. And to place that on Madison, I thought was unfair, and I think Greg did. And if we have the belief system that we do, if I wanted to draw on that, then I think some things are taken care of in due time. But the idea of saying he has no concept of what this religiosity is about. How do you describe something to someone who is very concrete? This is another thing that is one of the qualities with somebody with autism, is that try not to use too many metaphors. If I said, it's raining cats and dogs, some people look out and see if animals were falling from the ceiling or from the sky, literally. So there are things about Madison and trying to explain to him that there was somebody that you have never seen that lived 2,000 years ago in a distant place that you wouldn't really know about, that did something that might be able to save you from doing the bad things in life and that you'll be happy ever after. How do you wrap that package up and deliver it to somebody who can look at something and say, yeah, I can see that you've got your hand up. And it's concrete, it's there, it's real, it's in my existence. But to say, somebody in the next room is putting their hand up, and big deal. Then to put that in a religious nature onto someone, I don't know if that is a fair action to take.
So did you guys decide not to baptize Madison?
Mm-hmm.
To this day, he's never been baptized?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And we didn't
was that a problem with the bishop or anyone? Did anyone?
Everybody was very accepting.
Okay.
Now, probably with me mentioning this, there will be some very zealous person say, why don't we, but it was a conscious effort at the time. And maybe as Madison develops, because we do see continual development with him, he has been severely impacted with his autism. We do see development with him, and if he can get to the point where some of these abstractions may make more sense to him, that may be an action that we would want to take.
But he's 20, what? 20,
He's 28.
28, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about, was there a point where you did sort of a intellectual IQ test? Were you ever able to assess his intellectual functioning, cognitive functioning? Is that a sensitive thing to ask?
No, it's not a sensitive thing to ask. In a way, it's kind of amusing because it's all over the place. You were saying that you don't meet two people that are the same. There are some ways that Madison has an understanding that is incredible.
In what kind of areas?
All right.
If you don't mind sharing.
This is probably the only real glimpse that I'd ever seen with Madison, that he understood a concept, but in a way it was kind of a concrete, even though it was an abstract concept. When my mother passed away, we were just getting ready to close the casket. And
He was how old?
He would have been 11.
Okay. 11-ish.
11-ish.
Okay.
And 11, 12-ish. And we were just ready to close the casket. And we'd each said goodbye. And Greg said, is there anything you want to do, Madison? And he goes up and he looks at my mom and says, goodbye, Grandma. Goodbye forever. And we were absolutely bowled over with this particular concept because we'd never really mentioned anything of that nature or putting death in that type of a context for him. And he understood that there was some sort of a finality to that. So Madison has kind of spotty learning. In some ways, he is very bright and cunning and fun and a tease. And in some ways, he hasn't got the faintest idea of the demands. He'd have no idea of what's on CNN or MSNBC or anything like that today. That would not be his world. He would not even understand the concepts of those things. But then at times, and his sensitivities with maybe putting a hand out or giving a glance, or in his artwork. And he does some rather excellent artwork. And you start to see what is in the autistic mind through his art. And he is working with a wonderful Russian lady who will go out with him in the evenings, and they will sometimes go to a restaurant and they'll stay, and he will draw. And the perceptions that he has had in looking at maybe a suggestion of something to draw give you an insight that is uncanny in how he perceives space, how he perceives relationships, how he perceives color, that is far superior to most artists that I have ever encountered.
Wow. Okay. That's powerful.
And it is. And I've been in arts administration for a long period of time to make that type of a statement. Now, is it reflected in a naivete in a way? Yes, but when you look at it, there is something astounding there. So it's one of those other mysteries about autism.
Do you have some of his art hanging in your home?
We do. And actually, we're doing a campaign with our foundation, and his artwork is going to be the centerpiece of it. It has two individuals that are kind of holding up a board that has a heart on it, and the two people are behind the board, so you can only see part of their faces. And it's about the idea of the unseen population being seen, and the heart is kind of representing the community. And he did that without even being asked, and it just happened, and it represents things in such a profound fashion that it's rather incredible.
Send us a photo of that if you will.
I will.
We'll add it to the,
I've got one
show
out in the
notes.
car.
Is that all right, Cody?
Get that for you.
What would his do you even have a sense for his verbal vocabulary, like how many words he's spoken, different words, or any, just to get a sense for how his autism manifests?
All right. Madison can read, and he can
Do you have a
read
sense for the
something.
level? Could you even
Well,
assess for that?
it's interesting. He could read something like Ronald Dahl, Harry Potter. Now, whether he understands that, but he can read the words and sound the words. And sounds very typical in somebody reading, one of these books. But if you turned to Madison and you said, "How do you feel about something?" he'd look at you like, Or if you say, "How was your day?" "Good day." But whether that's autistic or if that's a male response, I don't know. I have to smile at that one because sometimes my
Male.
my neurotypical son coming home, it was hard to get answers out of him. "How was your day?" "Fine." So
What about expressions about emotion or feeling or happiness or
one
sadness?
of the things that has happened several times during Madison's life, and this was probably the most heart-wrenching thing. I would go into his room sometimes at night, and he had a mattress on the floor because he kept rolling out of bed. So we decided that we were going to keep things closer to the floor so there would only be 8 inches of detriment. And I would go into his room when he was young, and that was the case. And sometimes he would just be sobbing. And I could kind of see that he was seeing the actions and the activities of other people and kind of saying, "I can't do what they're doing."
So he had some sense of self-awareness relative to other people.
Yes.
You suspect.
I suspect.
Yeah.
And that he would see things, and I think he wanted to do things, and he realized that he couldn't do things. And then I think he pulled back a little bit from some of those other types of things that he had seen. And maybe it was seeing a baseball team being selected at the elementary school, and he happened to be with other people, and that wasn't his experience, or whatever it happened to be. And that has happened periodically, even up until today. That sometimes he will have tears of just why, and not necessarily verbalizing those things, but being around somebody that long. I kind of boast that we probably have about 30 PhDs in Madison when you think about 28 years, 24/7. How many years does it take to get a PhD?
4 to 6.
Uh-huh. So we've got several.
To 8, to 10, depending on the person, right?
So we've got a few doctorates in Madisonology. So I think we can read some of his things relatively well, but his art gives us an insight into that a little bit. He doesn't necessarily draw the things that you think he would want to do, but he gives us insight to some of his feelings. And we intentionally have not guided him and saying, "Okay, we're going to give you art classes and you're going to learn perspective, and here's a dot, and the roads all go this way, and or here's a circle, and if you shade it this way, it's going to look like it's round, and here's a triangle, if you shade it this way, it's going to look like a cone." We've never done that. We've let him express very immediately what he sees, what he feels, how he perceives color and shape. And it's really astounding.
Have you ever tried sign language as a way of communicating? Is that typically done, or at least attempted?
Very often that's done in classes, and some of that happened when he was in elementary school. They tried that, and it wasn't one of the preferred ways of communicating. There were pictures for a while. He does happen to take speech classes right now from a very interesting woman, and there aren't many people that are speech teachers working with adults. And especially working with adults on the spectrum, there may be people that work with brain injury or accidents or things like that, but not necessarily with autism. But we found this woman, and his vocabulary has increased greatly. I don't necessarily have a count of the words, but he's not going to sit down and say, gee, Mom, this is what happened today, and let me tell you how somebody was mean to me or how I saw something.
What would be some of a day's typical verbal communications then?
How was your day today, Madison? Good. Where did you go? Museum. What did you see? Pictures, waterfall, people. But the thing that I see, even though that sounds very simplistic, he has been able to alert us when there's been unkindnesses, or there was one person that was being a little bit abusive to him, and he was able to give us
How would he communicate that?
One, his physical reaction when somebody came into the house.
You watch that?
Oh, yeah. And
because a caregiver could be mean,
right?
When someone's not watching,
right? The caregiver could be taking somebody out into the community, or Madison out to the community, and how could Madison necessarily come home and tell us? But by watching things and then doing some more investigation under the surface, yes, that was the case. And needless to say, that person was only with us for about 10 minutes after that, just long enough to get his coat and get out of the house. But Madison will communicate different types of things, his hopes, anxieties. He becomes very frightened with bad movies. And I will tell you something here. I'll get into the bad movies in just a minute. I have found something with Madison that I suspect with many other individuals on the spectrum because of this propensity to like animation. That I think through the autistic eye, that when you see something that's on camera, like I'm looking at you right now, and you have blinds behind you, and there's a light over here, and you've got a microphone, and you've got a computer. And I think very often with autistic individuals, they take into their mind everything that they see, and they don't know how to eliminate the background, eliminate the computer, eliminate the microphone, and get it into the face. That it's hard to sort through those things. And with animation, your central character is always being followed. And you can see it in one frame and then another frame and who they're talking to. And there's not as many extraneous things. And I think that's one of the reasons and one of the magics behind animation. And I know autistic individuals that are in their 60s that prefer animation as opposed to regular movies.
Interesting.
There should be a study in there someplace.
Yeah. So in terms of what his behavior would be like in a church setting, is it disruptive? Is it just quiet? Is it like impossible? Would he sit for an hour in primary or 2 hours? Or talk about, and start childhood and then how it progressed into adolescence and even now. Was church even a possibility? And if so, what was his experience at church?
It was very mixed all along, and I think of one story, and I hate to tell stories like this and embarrass our kids, but I'm going to tell this story. There was a lovely lady that handled the nursery at church, and we took Madison, and we'd had a little bit of encouragement of, yeah, she'll be able to handle things, and things will be fine, and you go into the other meetings. Well, a little while later, or a few minutes later, we hear this woman going down the hall, and you could hear fast footsteps saying, Madison, Madison, come back, come back. She had tried to change his diaper. He got up, and he took off, and she had a clean one in the other hand.
He's running naked through the church halls?
He was commando, just going.
At what age?
He was probably about 3.5 at the time. And so I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. And we had that type of an equivalent several times in his life. And there were never any things made available for Madison. And it's interesting when you think about it in the church, say a congregation is 300 people. Typically, it's 2% of the population that's on the spectrum. So put down 6 people. And then you put 2 parents, and I joke with the rest of the country, you'd say 2 siblings. In Utah, you'd say maybe 5. So in a congregation, you would have 30 or more people impacted by autism. When Madison was diagnosed and when he was young, there were a couple of other cases that were kind of emerging, but no one really stepped forward to say, I know you've got a challenge here, can we help? There was a psychiatrist that happened to be in our ward, and he came over one Sunday and talked to me to see if there was something that he could do to be helpful. But Taylor making anything specific for Madison was never really done. And so that inclusion was very, very hard. And there was never really a place for him and young men, young women. The leaders didn't know how to deal with it, and so they wouldn't reach out. So there wasn't a space. There wasn't a space in scouting. There were opportunities. We tried to take him to sacrament meeting, but again, if you're hearing about somebody that died 2,000 years ago, and people are bearing witness of all of that stuff, and you're sitting there and you're saying, what do I like? And it might just be the music. It's hard to sit still. And so it became less and less frequent that Madison would go to church, because there were other things that he could benefit from and enjoy. And sometimes it was playing some nice music. Sometimes it was playing the tabernacle choir. But it was his way of connecting with things, and not necessarily being in with the group and forced to conform with the group.
Were there instances where you tried to have Madison, at church, and members seemed annoyed or frustrated or angry?
Yeah, there was a lot of question about it, and people didn't like the extraneous noise. And there were times that he would sit next to the wall, because we would try to keep him a little bit contained, and he would start to pull off the drywall, and that wasn't necessarily, the favorite thing of people taking care of the chapel. And there was a situation, it was on an Easter, and we happened to have general conference that day. And because I was part of the Wesley community, I was invited to an Easter service at what had been the Clintons' congregation, because my friend happened to be the musical director there. And we went to the services, and Madison looked around, and he wanted to sit up front because it was a huge space. And Greg was kind of saying, don't do it, don't do it. And I said, well, I think you'll be all right, even though we're on the front row. And after all of the good music, and the pastor stands up there after my friend's beautiful performance for Easter morning, that Madison looks up at him and looks over at me and says, go home now, and said it to the top of his lungs, just as this fellow is getting up to give the Easter sermon. And we start to go out some doors, and it happened to be into a corridor that was locked, and so we have to make a retreat and then wind our way all through the congregation. And I could see very bitter looks from that congregation as well. I don't think it's something that is necessarily confined to our tradition, but people have a hard time, I think, not dealing with people who are at a different pace. Sir Ken Robinson, and I'll often look at him, he did a thing on education, and he made statements about the education system, that we are processed through our education by date of manufacture. So if you're 6 years old, you're in first grade. By the time you're 12 years old, you're here. And that we all process through by date of manufacture until we graduate, either college or university. And I think something with Madison, he would show us the date of manufacture didn't make any difference, because sometimes he would learn faster, sometimes he would learn slower. But maybe the thing that's the important thing is not necessarily if you're on time for every one of those milestones, but whether you achieve those milestones on whatever your timetable happens to be. And I think that has probably been the most difficult thing for most of the people in our congregations or in our ward, to understand that Madison wasn't going to be hitting all of those things, and he wasn't going to be ordained at a particular time, and that he wasn't going to be passing the sacrament at a particular time. And how do you make special allowance for a boy of 13 when he's not doing the things that the other boys are doing? And I think that can be hard.
Would there have been a point where you or Greg might have thought, maybe he can pass the sacrament, let's give it a try? Oh, I guess he hadn't been baptized, so no priesthood, right? So
Right.
That wasn't even a possibility.
And isn't there something that is really profoundly significant about passing the sacrament? If you really look at it, you are doing something that is very sacred, because you are representing the body and the blood of Christ. Would Madison understand that? And is there an obligation to have some sort of an understanding if you are going to share that within community? So those are some big questions. I don't say that ours is a right answer. Ours is our answer.
So did you and Greg end up tag teaming on Sundays where one would stay home with Madison and one would go?
Yes, that's exactly it. And then we would get these things of, I think that couple is partially active. And we say, oh, they have no idea how active we are when we're not, and what we're doing. And so we would tag team very much. And then there were times that Madison really wanted and needed to have both parents around on a quiet Sunday morning. And if you can't minister to your own child and their needs, I think your actions fall short with others.
Did having Madison ever affect what callings you and or Greg were ever able to accept? Did you ever turn down callings? Would that have been something you were comfortable doing? I know Greg at least has served on a high council at one point. So
he has.
That shows some level of engagement that's pretty intense, right?
And it had been. And I think there's probably a lot of other reasons that people are saying, well, I'm not quite certain where they stand on other types of things. It may have affected things. I don't know how it could have been that I would have either been a Relief Society president or he would have been a bishop and still take care of the kids and an aging mother. There's only so many hours in the day, although I did work with the Cultural Arts Committee at the Visitor Center in Washington, D.C., but that fit within my professional aura as well, and I was involved with that for about 16 years. But I could do that at times when Madison was at school. I could arrange things, and I could organize things and do a number of those things. And then Greg would be with Madison if I had to be to a performance.
So you weren't able to accept many of the normal callings that you might have otherwise. Is that fair to say?
Right. I was never involved in young women or things of that nature. But again, it may have been more that she's been in a seminary. Now, why is she doing that? Is she looking someplace else? Isn't she pleased with where she is? Isn't this her home? I think there may have been more questions about my involvement in the seminary and maybe some of Greg's writings more than some of the other types of things. So I don't know what it is, but I know it can interfere with a lot of people. I know there have been a lot of families where there have been church ambitions, and they would have liked to have followed a particular course of action like their brothers or sisters have been doing, and they're not able to do it because they're very busy and taking care of things and issues at home.
Did that ever make you or Greg feel like a second-class citizen at church a little bit, or or did it make you feel like, yay, we don't have to do a bunch of stuff that we don't want to do?
Well, at times, and I think sometimes it's your perception of things. And I guess in a way, it was very liberating being able to be around other religious traditions and so forth, that we felt very much like the Mormon community was our community, but we also saw that there were other communities as well, and there were some beautiful communities. And so feeling a second-class citizen maybe in some ways, but then understanding that those things happen in other traditions as well. Sometimes there was a bit of a sting to it, but we were too busy getting on with life. But I know a lot of other people who have found it a tremendous pain. And then I think sometimes in adult life, there are those things with date of manufacture. Okay, by this time you're an elder, by this time you're progressing through here, and you're a high priest, and then you're in a bishopric, and you're da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I think it's very hurtful for those people who had pictured themselves in those roles by particular times, and that they can't manage it. And I think of a young family that was in our ward who had two children, now not with autism, but very disabled, both requiring very specialized wheelchairs and different types of things. I can only imagine too, because they were much more traditional in their religious activities than probably Greg and myself. But I think they would have felt rewarded somehow if they would have been able to accept some callings, but it was very hard for them.
Did members ever try and reassure you or console you or even advance theological ideas or speculations? Talk about ways that members maybe were helpful or not so helpful in their comments to you.
I think sometimes in our mourning and sometimes with disabilities, there can be some very well-meaning comments that can sting. And the idea of, well, things aren't good for Madison here, but they will be later. And saying, well, but it's right now that we want to deal with. And that there are other people like Madison that are hurting. And don't we have an obligation to help people now rather than just saying, oh, it may be miserable now, but it's going to be good somewhere, somehow on the other side. And maybe it's just a view of life, that life is very precious and that we need to embrace what life is right here and right now. That's what we know and that's what's at hand. And people have made all sorts of different types of statements about, oh, but he'll be perfected, da-da-da-da. And that comes into another very interesting thing.
Yeah, so people, the doctrine would be that in the resurrection, he would be made whole.
Right. And that can be extremely offensive to a lot of folks that are on the autism spectrum. And especially maybe more within even the Asperger's range of things. Because people identify very often who they are by how they perceive the world. And some people feel that if their autism was cured, that they would not be who they are. And they feel that who they are is very important and very proper. And so sometimes having statements of, oh, you have this challenge right now, but you will be perfect on the other side is tremendously offensive. And that is...
Why though? Why isn't it hopeful? It's meant as a message of hope.
It's meant as a message of hope, but it's saying you are imperfect here, you have struggles here, something is not right with you, and I have things that are right with me and they're not with you, and I can look at you differently, but somehow on the other side you'll be equal to me. And I've had people express that type of feeling about what it means when people make those types of statements.
So I'm going to do something that I do sometimes, which is either to act a little thick or to ask a question that I wonder that a listener might be asking.
Okay, great.
What if a listener says, well, there is something wrong? There is a deficit.
Well,
so and I know that's probably really offensive, but help listeners understand.
All right, let me give you a metaphor that I've used, and it was when my son and I went to Jordan, and we were working on a biblical archaeological dig, and we had been introduced to this place where we were going to be staying for the next several weeks. And there was a long counter that had wash basins in it. And so I went in right after our trip and arriving. to go in and wash my face. But I knew that there was limited water and that you'd only use a quick amount because all of the water had to be put up on the roof. Well, I turn the water on, and what do I feel? On my toes, it gets wet. And I look underneath the sink, and I see that the pipe is only about this long. It doesn't have that curve that we're usually accustomed to. And the water would drop down, drop into a trough, and then go out an opening in the wall, and the water would go out, and before it would even hit the ground, it had evaporated. That has become kind of a symbol within our family. As we look at that, they answered a lot of right questions. They didn't have to pay for extra pipe. They don't have to pay for plumbers, and things evaporate and are taken care of. It would not have been the right answer in Salt Lake City, but it was the right answer in Jordan, in that particular environment. And it became a metaphor that there's often more than one right way to do something. And if you free yourself up to know that there may be more than one right answer, the answer may be A, B, and C. And if you look at people and you look at the importance of people, and somebody may process something differently, does it mean that they're broken? Not necessarily. It may be that they have a different operating system. What is best, PC or Apple? They're two different systems.
Yeah, depends on what you're doing.
Right, but they can both answer questions, and they can both be the right answer. And so somebody having a different operating system, does that mean that they're broken? Does it mean that maybe they answer questions and look at life differently than you do? That may be one of the major gifts that some people on the spectrum can give to the rest of the world. There's more than one way of looking at things. We probably have artwork in the Sistine Chapel that was done by individuals that were on the spectrum. They may not have been produced otherwise. Steve Jobs most likely was on the spectrum. You probably wouldn't be utilizing that, or you wouldn't be utilizing other technology without a different view of the world. So I think we need to be careful, and if we do have the theological beliefs that we do, and God creates people to be who they are, do we need to give greater allowance and maybe learn to look through a different lens at times? And so that type of a statement of saying you're broken, is it that the person that they're referring to is broken, or is it that their lens is broken and they don't look at two right answers to some situations? Now, indeed, with autism, there can be some very dramatic things. There can be people that are self-injurious. There can be people that have violent outbursts and different types of things. Those types of things are not good for the individual or the people that they're around. Those types of things may be things that we need to address. But when it comes to everyday life, maybe there are other right ways of doing things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's really powerful, really powerful. And I know my question, I made some comments, I asked some questions about Greg during my interview with him recently that really offended people. And I know that some of these questions are going to sound sharp, but
No,
I don't know
ask them.
how else we learn if we
Ask
don't.
the questions.
Yeah, I don't know how else we learn if we don't even ask the hard stuff.
No, you have to ask the hard questions and not be afraid of where truth takes you.
Yeah. So, but in Mormon theology, you know, if you look at kind of Saturday's Warrior theology, we were all spirits or intelligences and then spirits, and we all kind of chose what was going to happen when we came to this earth. Then we'd come here and have the experience, and then we would die, and then we would, our spirits would continue on, and then we'd be resurrected in sort of a wholeness. I think that's pretty much what Mormons think is the plan of salvation.
And it could be, but that's a play. That was written by a person or people that I happen to know. And I think it is a wonderful metaphor. I think it's comforting for a lot of people. I think there's a lot of literature that is comforting to people, whether that happens to be factual or not. I think sometimes people see a simple answer and they want that to be incorporated in their lives, and that's how the world must function. But at least in my life, I've found that there's a lot more nuance. There's a lot more areas of gray than I had ever anticipated. And this is coming from somebody that was extremely orthodox. And in some ways, I still feel that I'm quite orthodox when I'm around my friends in Washington, D.C. I seem very conservative. I come to Utah and people look at me like, maybe not so much. But we need to look at what things are and what the implications are. Saturday's Warriors was a great musical, but so was The Sound of Music. And that talked about war and giving and struggles and unity and all sorts of other things. I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from. But
so you've done a lot of digging into theology.
Mm-hmm.
What is your theology around Madison, if it's not the typical Mormon plan of salvation? Or do you have one?
I do.
If you're comfortable sharing.
Oh, yes. I live with a great deal of hope. I'm very much an optimist, but I think I'm somewhat of a realist as well. And my hope is that human potential, and I think this is a huge component of Mormon theology, and sometimes we neglect it, that people have great potential. And I think if we can work with people in helping them reach their potential, that is a gift to them and it is a gift to us. And I hope that things on the other side are taken care of. And I have a great hope that some of the things that we try to implant on God aren't necessarily the case, but that there are other things that may be even more powerful than we have ever even considered. And I hope and I trust that there's an afterlife. And I think Madison plays into that. But I get up every morning asking, what is my obligation to Madison today? And I have to deal with today and alleviate the pain that I can today for both him and all the Madisons that I can possibly reach and help. And I see my work as being much more immediate because I know what's here and now. On the other side, I hope there's some wonderful things. But within our theology, there's still a lot of stories that I can't quite buy into that some people do.
Why not, though? Well, because it would give you hope. I think that's why these stories are created, to give people consolation and hope.
But see, I do have hope.
Right. But why not just grab onto these stories because they're Mormon and they're hopeful?
Well, because that's the easy way out.
Why?
Because I think sometimes if we grab onto a story and we say, well, we're told that this is something, or we're promised that this is something, it gives us a crutch. And sometimes we need crutches, and we can all need assistance at different times and at different stages in our growth and progress. But if it keeps us from thinking and from grappling with what really could be or what is, I think we fall far short of reaching our potentials as human beings. If we say, oh, I've always been told that, okay, I'll just accept it and I'll go on. And when you're confronted with something like a disability, with dementia, with death, I think sometimes our answers are a little bit too simplistic to give credence to the gift that we've been given, and that's the gift of life. And sometimes I think we trivialize life by putting some of these stories on top of them, rather than really jumping in and saying, okay, I've got a friend who is going through a very tragic situation. I need to be there by their side, listen, understand, and love, and not necessarily say, well, I've got the answer, and it's just that everything's going to be fine on the other side. I think one falls shallow and misses the mark. And at least for my life, I feel that I have to go a bit differently. Again, there may be two right ways of doing things.
Sounds like if I had to summarize what I hear you saying, you're saying maybe we don't really know for sure how everything's going to flesh out. So let's be okay. Let's be optimistic, but be okay with saying who knows for sure, other than having a hope that things will be made right somehow. And then not letting some superficial, overly simplistic vision about the afterlife take us away from doing all we can in the present moment where we have the most power.
Right, where we have the most power, and where we may need to roll up our sleeves and grapple with issues. Sometimes it's very easy to say, well, so-and-so had the answer, and I'm going to quote so-and-so, so I don't have to think about it anymore. And I think...
Because they want to get rid of the sadness or the pain or the guilt, right?
Or they want to go and watch TV
right.
and not have to think about it. And that was kind of a flip answer on my part. But sometimes I think the grappling brings us closer to the divine and brings us closer to God. And if we make things too simplistic, I think we make God in our own image and make God far too simplistic. And I think that's doing a huge disservice, at least the way I view the world.
Lisa writes, wow, I never thought about it as an easy way out or a crutch. Makes so much sense. To Lisa.
We should talk, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa, for writing. Okay. Has any of these experiences with Madison challenged your faith or your Mormon faith or, your Orthodox faith? Did you ever have a dark night of the soul? Or, a lot of people that come on Mormon Stories have had faith crises or have lost their faith altogether. Sometimes it's from reading books or studying history. Sometimes it's from how they're treated at church or how they perceive others to be treated at church. Have you ever experienced any of that to the extent that you're willing or able to share?
Yeah, I probably experienced all of those things. And sometimes it's that 3 a.m. moment where a lot of things are in question. And whether one's faith is in question, whether you see that you hope that there's justice within your community, and you question whether justice is really there and if it's valued, whether compassion in a very real, immediate sense is there, and sometimes you question. I've got to say that looking at the Mormon community, the Mormon church, I see a lot of good, positive, incredible things. And those are part of my heritage. They're part of my belief. They're part of what has opened the door for me to be able to communicate with God. Now, do I see that there's sometimes some silliness and some trivialities that surround that? Yeah, I do. I see it sometimes laid at the feet of families that are dealing with disabilities. People can be well-meaning, but I hope we can help people to become more sensitive and to go into another level in dealing with some of these things and the practicality. I think we all become winners in this. And I don't think it diminishes God. I think it brings us into a reality of looking, or brings us into a position where we hope that we're encountering the reality of God and all of the power, all of the greatness, all of the love that is incorporated with having a faith.
So if your faith and theologies were kind of a pie chart, what percentage of it is sort of Orthodox Mormon versus more Protestant Christian, mainstream Christian versus Unitarian and not even particularly Christian? Would you even have a way to kind of
I would say
that?
So much of my world is colored by the palette that was presented to me as I grew up. And I feel very, very valid. Now, I may turn that around to say, how do other people perceive me? And they may perceive me as being either a lot more liberal or at a slightly different point. I think I'm at a slightly different point, but I think it's because of examination and taking this thing very seriously. That's the reason that I ended up on the doorstep of this person at BYU, is that I wanted to learn, I wanted to understand. There was a driving thing within me. So within that pie chart, I understand where a lot of other people and a lot of other faith traditions are. And I'm probably not as great a missionary because I can see a lot of people that are happy within their traditions and that their families and a number of things that they hold very important. I don't feel that I necessarily need to extricate them from that and have them sit on the pew next to me, and that somehow they're better off being with me and designing their families and so forth, or the heritage that they have been brought up with. I have a problem personally. Am I happy to share some of the things that I think are so glorious about Mormonism? Yeah, and I've talked to a lot of people about that. So I probably have a foot in a couple of different camps, and I've got a lot of friends in many different camps. And I am so glad because they help me see that in so many arenas and in so many questions, there are multiple answers. And I think that we tend to look at things as either being one way or another. I think my relationship with God has given me great latitude in those things. That is working for me. I can't necessarily put that on somebody else. But I think working with Madison, and I see shortcomings in some of the ways we deal with disabilities. I wish there were more ramps going up to the podium. A simple fix. That would help a lot more people in our
Just make that standard. Every chapel has ramps.
Remove the sacrament table in the old ones. We don't have a secretary, or not the sacrament table, but the secretary's table. We don't use that anymore. Put ramps in there. Let people with disabilities have easier access to get up and share their experience. And maybe we're a little bit reluctant, or we feel that we are a little bit more powerful because we lift somebody in a wheelchair up to the podium. But that's making them dependent on us rather than them reaching their potential and having us see them in front of us. And I think we need to be reminded that this mortal thing is very ephemeral. And I worked with a woman when I represented the country as one of the Mothers of the Year. The two of us both worked with disabilities, and she's the only casting director in Hollywood that works with casting individuals with disabilities in roles that are about individuals with disabilities. And she taught me a great deal, and she said, people that seem a little bit smug about disabilities or feel like, oh, that poor brother or that poor sister or that poor so-and-so, she said, be careful, because we're only a moment or two away, any of us, from having a disability. We could walk out of here, we could fall, we could injure our back and be in a wheelchair for the rest of our lives. It is near us. How do we deal with those that we encounter? How would we want our futures to be if that had happened to us? And I think that may be the way that we need to look at autism and dealing with individuals on the spectrum, or dealing with any one of a number of disabilities, and to not necessarily look in pity, but look with potential.
What else could the church or members or leadership do to make the Mormon experience more friendly, supportive of individuals with disabilities, with autism, or the families who support them?
Well, I think maybe making it, seeing that disabilities are a normal part of the human condition, and treat it more that way. That yes, we need better access so you can get up to the microphone, so you can speak, so you can bear your testimony. So that family that I was telling you about with the two kids in the wheelchairs, they always had to stay down by the pews when all of the primary children were singing, because there wasn't an easy way to get them up there. And if they were up there, there wasn't a space for them. So how can they fully participate? Can we think of that with those with autism or any disability? How can we help people more fully participate in what we feel is important? If we feel it's important, we should be able to share that. Why is it more important to feel that we can convert somebody than it is to accommodate those that are under our own roof so they can fully participate in our religious experience?
How would a ward effectively care for a child or an adolescent who had, let's just say, more cognitively impaired autism? Would it be a special primary worker specially assigned? Would it be just nursery? Would it be hire a special needs, expert? Like what could a ward creatively do to provide services so that a family could just fully enjoy their church experience and not have to trade off like you and Greg so often had to do?
That's a wonderful question. I think something that I probably would have benefited from would have been having a group of the sisters come over and sit around and say, look, we know that there's some challenges here. We have challenges with our typical kids, and you've got a few extra things going on here. What can we do? And what can happen? And can we help? Can we help our kids that are your kids' age be more inclusive? And maybe make that phone call or say, I haven't seen Madison out to church for a while, but would he be able to come to a birthday party? We're having one out in the backyard, and he may enjoy that moon bounce. He may enjoy that pony. Can he come over and join us? Those phone calls never came.
Never came.
Never came.
And this was sort of suburban Maryland, mostly good people. I mean,
good people.
My wife Margie actually was raised in the Potomac, Maryland ward. Yeah.
Wonderful people.
Yeah.
It's not a fault. And so sometimes when people don't know what to do, so I would pose that. There have been situations, I know one fellow, he isn't LDS, but he was able to gather several of his friends around and say, if I'm not around or if something happens to me, I want you to know my son. I want you to know what he likes, what his abilities are, where he is in school, because if I needed it, could you step in and between the 5 or 6 of you, could you each do a little bit of fathering? How powerful would that be? And we have an environment within our wards and in our stakes where we could do that. And even if somebody moves out of a ward, could they still stay in touch? Because we have aunts and uncles. I mean, our families are dispersed. Why couldn't we have that type of a support team that when Ralph, when he is 6, people come together and say, I'm going to be part of this child's community. That's what people usually do at weddings and in the Jewish community when there's bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs. People gather together saying, we're part of that community. You are part of us. Can we do that in the disability community? We have it within scouting. Let's all go for a camp out. Let's all do this. And there's a type of bonding that happens. But sometimes with a disability, and I'm saying there are times that there are breakthrough things and there are good things that happen. But if we could have that more as the norm, I think it would help a lot of families. And I think it would help siblings feel a little bit more comfortable rather than saying, oh yeah, my brother's always the one that's making the noise, or oh, I always have to push my sister in the wheelchair because it's hard for her to navigate in between people, going into the chapel. But to say, is it my turn? Can I help you with your sister? Or how is your sister doing today? Oh, hey, this is cool. Are you guys going someplace after church? Or, what did you do yesterday? Just so there was a more natural type of flow, I think it could do a great deal for both the congregation and for the families.
So are you saying that maybe sometimes it's easier for ward members to just kind of either ignore it or say, well, that's their issue, and just to kind of avoid it.
Yeah,
because
sometimes
it's
when you don't know
uncomfortable.
what to do, how do you do something? In fact, we're working with something right now and trying to inform the country because of the foundation that we have, that autistic kids grow up to be autistic adults because there's an unemployment rate of 80 to 85%. But how can you offer jobs to people or have job slots open in your law firm or your business or your restaurant or your computer company or whatever if you don't know those people exist? And so we're trying to shine a light on adults with autism and say, yes, that movie that you saw with somebody on the autism spectrum going across getting their diploma, that's not the end of the story. They have just completed maybe 1/4 of their life. And now they've got the other 3/4 that they're going to be facing. And how do we help in that? And how do we make that part of our community a viable part of our community?
So talk about kind of the main initiatives of the Madison House Autism Foundation and the ways you're trying to make a difference.
Well, we have our Autism After 21 campaign where we've had April 21st, the middle of Autism Awareness Month, declared as Autism After 21 Day. And we're going to be having an event here in Salt Lake in the fall. We've got some activities in Washington, and other states are starting to participate with that. We have within the foundation the Autism Housing Network, and that has examples of different types of housing options across the country that go beyond group homes. Some people want to have community. Some people like the idea of a group home or an apartment. But there's such a wide array of individuals, there have to be more answers because there is for the neurotypical population. We could live in any one of a number of different environments. And we're
How
trying
can
to
group homes fall short? What are some ways that they can fall short?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. Their intent is very well placed. But in a way, it is a reaction to early things with institutions. And we recall some of the movies, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and where people were in
mistreatment,
abuse, neglect, over medication, all sorts of very bad things. And Eunice Shriver, who happens to have been a friend,
that is Sergeant Shriver's wife,
and JFK's
Kennedy.
Sister.
Okay, right, yeah, okay.
And she was a neighbor of ours.
Oh, wow.
But she had gone into a number of these places, and there was footage about some of the neglect that happened. And so the pendulum has swung over to the other direction, saying people need to be right in the middle of the community. And that can be very important for some people within a typical community. And if that's where somebody wants to be and that's where they can best manifest their abilities and their skills and where they want to be. But a group home may have 3 to 4 people living in it. It may be people you want to live with. And the goal would be, well, when somebody arrives here, the neighbors come over with a plate of cookies and welcome you there. And when there's a neighborhood barbecue, come on over. That's not necessarily the case. And group homes are often regulated throughout the country, sometimes having to be 1/4 mile away from one another, so there's not too much of a density. What if we said that all males that fit your profile had to be separated by 1/4 mile? You couldn't have a neighbor that fit your demographic. And that's happening in the disabilities world. And so we're trying to open up options for community. It can be smaller communities, it can be larger. We want to have the integration in it with the neurotypical population as well. But that's one of the initiatives that Madison House is working on. We are encouraging colleges and universities to make it possible for people to have education that can go on to college. And sometimes it means an accommodation or two that can make things flow better and that people can have success. It may be extended test time. It may be not having classrooms with fluorescent lights. It could be any one of a number of things. Sometimes they're not huge solutions, but they can all make a huge difference. And we were gifted the equity in a 400-acre farm in Maryland. And we're trying to combine the autistic population, veterans, and the neurotypical population into work training, therapeutic writing, and sometimes a healing experience of just being, in the country. So there's a number of initiatives that we're working on. And we're hoping to improve the world for Madison and all of the Madisons and the Melindas and everybody out there. And it's been a very interesting process. We're the only organization of its type in the country.
Is the farmland or the acreage, are there residents living on it right now, or is that
we've got
premature?
10 building lots that we may be able to put the housing on. We do have people living and working on the farm. We've got people on the spectrum that are working there, and we did have, and this comes into a glorious portion of, I think, Mormonism. There was a mission president out there that saw that there were some missionaries that had greater challenges going up and knocking on doors and being involved in that type of an environment, and saw that they could benefit being in a more agricultural environment and then still go out in the evening with the other companions and work with the discussions. And we've had missionaries volunteering at the farm, and this mission president also had a number of his missionaries volunteering there, assisting with therapeutic writing and making that environment very hospitable to those with disabilities who were coming out for various experiences and some therapies. And I think that's, and there's also Just Serve, which is a kind of an offshoot that was put together by the Prices, about service, and it's in another community, doesn't have anything really to do with the church, but a lot of the people from Just Serve who are LDS have come and spent time in service on the farm, which I think helps bring a new normal, because people are working side by side with those with disabilities, and I think that translates into Sunday and every other day of the week within the congregations as well.
Any other activities or goals or pillars of the Madison House Autism Foundation before we maybe talk a little bit more about Madison? Did we cover pretty much the main?
That's it,
things you want to cover?
and
Okay.
just making certain that the nation is aware of this population and that we can open doors and make certain that their talents, abilities, and challenges are recognized. And you notice that I use those 3 words. Not everybody is a savant. There may be some that are, but there's a lot of abilities, but there are challenges as well.
Got it. So to end this second segment, what has Madison's sort of adult life been like? Is he still living at home? I remember visiting Greg once, I believe, when he cooked for me, but I believe he had to turn the gas off because if I remember right, a fire hazard, just leaving the ability to start fires could be a fire hazard. Am I remembering right? Or
You are.
is he still living at home?
He's still living at home, but there had been an interesting situation. Madison had gone away to summer camp because there's a wonderful camp in upstate New York, and it's about the only time we ever get a break. But Madison loves it, and he learns a lot while he's up there. But one of the things that he had learned one summer was to make fires, because it's a really good way to have hot dogs and marshmallows. And when he came home, he liked the idea of fires, and we were trying to take away all of the matches and so forth, because he wasn't necessarily differentiating between having a fire in the house or out of the house, because there were fireplaces that were in shelters at the camp. So Madison was starting to take the large pretzel logs, the ones that are about 12 inches in length, and was trying to light those, and would go over to the stove This is the ingenuity of him, trying to light those to take them out to build a fire with pretzel sticks so he could roast his marshmallows. And when you don't have many logs in your living room or in the backyard, I thought it was really rather ingenious because they did look like logs. And that was probably about the time that we were trying to turn off the gas so Madison wouldn't be roasting marshmallows. But yeah, there are some challenges.
Is there an extent to which Madison is could present safety difficulties to himself or to other members of the family? Mm-hmm. And if so, can you talk about that?
Madison will probably never be able to live totally on his own. He has a fair amount of freedom around the house and things that he can do. And he goes out into the community and he has some wonderful tutors. And we call them tutors because we want them to work with lifelong learning and not just be people that take somebody out into the community, spend a little bit of time and bring somebody home. Now continue with your question because I went in a different direction.
Is he ever presented himself harm or others in the family with harm?
If he has been in a position where the medications weren't working correctly, sometimes he would have outbursts. And he would have meltdowns, and meltdowns could be in the middle of the community.
And as a full-grown man...
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about what that might be like?
There was a situation where he was out in the community a few years ago, and my husband and I happened to be going to another event and thought everything was taken care of. And he became very frustrated and put a hole through the wall of the library and was very upset about something. I don't know what the antecedent was to that having happened, but the police were called. And so here we're on our way to this event, and we're told that we should get back quickly. And it was a point of frustration for Madison, and it warranted having the police there. Now, is that what Madison is all of the time? No. But are there times that there are things of that nature that happen? Are there things that could happen if he didn't have people in his environment? Probably. And so for his safety, in large part, that he is going to need somebody to be with him.
Sort of 16 hours a day?
24 hours a day. I mean, you wouldn't want somebody to wake up in the middle of the night and not have anybody there. And I was talking about some of the scary movies and so forth. Some of the things from Fantasia, Night on Bald Mountain, and there's a couple of other Hanna-Barbera cartoons that are really quite dark. And if he watches those, he has nightmares and wakes up in the middle of the night. And he can't watch a lot of destructive things. That's not within who he is. So he will most likely need to have someone, unless over the next few years, as the brain changes and things that he's probably still a part of, if they happen in such a way that he can be more independent. We would love that, and we're working toward formulating as much independence as possible, because the more independent he is and the more he can express his desires with what he does want to do and doesn't prefer, the happier he is. But that's true with all of us. You know, if we can have input, then our lives are a lot different than if we don't feel that we have any control at all.
What would a typical adult day for Madison look like these days?
Well, that's another interesting question, because we've just started in on a new set of programming. We have somebody that's had about 16 years experience in working with young adults. And putting together things, anticipating what his behaviors, but also pushing him to achieve more and more things, because I think sometimes it's easy with caregivers to say, as long as I can make certain that we leave the house, things go smoothly, and we can get back, that's a successful day.
If he's not harmed.
If he's not harmed and he does no harm. But we're saying, no, Madison has a lot more capabilities than many people have seen in him. And now is the time, if he's going to develop these particular skills, that we've got to provide that opportunity. And we've got to be strong, because he's going to say, no, I don't want to do it, and be obstinate, and like all kids. And the more independent that he can become, the healthier he's going to become. And we look at things too, and I'll bring things up with health. It's $300 billion a year in care for those with autism, with direct services and lost productivity when parents have to drop out of the workforce. That's about half the defense budget. That's a lot of money.
300 billion.
300 billion. And that comes out of UC Davis, those statistics. And if we can help Madison be more independent and participate in the community, the less likely he will be to have heart conditions or diabetes or the things that are related to overweight with arthritis and all sorts of different types of things. So I think there's an imperative for us to make certain that individuals can participate, whether they're wonderful in working with Microsoft and doing those things, or whatever level of ability somebody has, so their health is better and is going to cost the country less. And I think that's something that we've got to emphasize with policymakers.
What are the chances that Madison will outlive you and Greg?
That's the thing that we get the question on a daily basis with the foundation by parents. What's going to happen when I'm no longer around? And that's going to happen with Greg and me. As much as we would like to deny it, each day adds another day to our age. And Madison, we want to have him as independent as possible so he could tell someone that he wasn't being treated well or kindly, or to express his desire that he would like to do something for Christmas, or that he would like to see a particular movie, or that he would like to work at a particular place. The more independence that we can give him, probably the better the outcome for him. But we don't know what the future is going to bring. And that's a travesty. Most parents have no idea. Although there's a very wide range of capabilities, a lot of people can live by themselves. But people still wonder, will there be somebody that is going to love my adult child? And that's not necessarily a given. And is there a place for my adult child? And is there a place for my adult child to work? That's what falls on the greater community, and that's also what falls onto the religious community. And the thing that I was talking about with this fellow that had brought his friends around to say, if I'm not around, can you help? Can you be there? Now, one of the inherent things there is that they're all going to be aging. And so if they're all 80 years old and there is an active 50-year-old, it may be harder for them. But maybe we can supplement that community or that group around the individual so somebody can check in, or somebody will notice if the meds aren't working right, or that there are some additional bruises on somebody, and to work in taking action to make certain that they're safe. I think that's part of our obligation as a community.
Have you contemplated having one of his siblings take over care for him? I imagine that's a tremendous responsibility.
Well, it's a tremendous responsibility. And when someone has been a sibling and they've given up, and I started getting in on this a while ago, when somebody has given up their childhood,
that's the extra childhood, yeah.
By the time,
the grandkids.
Do the grandkids have to give up their childhood so Uncle so-and-so can be in the house, or that mom or dad is always over there because there's so many problems? Do we need to help solve that? Because it was not the child, the sibling. The sibling didn't arrange for the other sibling to be born. And if they have been contributing in the well-being, what is that ending point, or is there a point where society has some responsibility? And I'm not saying that most of the siblings would even want to abandon their sibling, but what does it mean to take on that responsibility? Does it mean bringing them into their home? And what does that look like? That's tough. And even I know a lot of neurotypical siblings that wouldn't want to live in the same house as adults.
most.
So,
all.
So it's nothing that is really out of the norm, but we just don't think about it in the same way.
So are you able to tell us what your specific plan is for Madison if you guys pass away?
And it is evolving. It is evolving, and that is one of the hardest questions, because do we sell our home and get a smaller place that has an apartment area for Madison? Well, then what happens if we pass away? Does that mean that our son or daughter moves into that house so Madison has a stable place? Or do we work with maybe some of these communities where there may be several individuals that are on the spectrum, where we would hope that we would be able to have an atmosphere where there would be responsible people in the community as a natural flow that could help look after Madison, and that we hope that we can provide that he would have some additional care by planning with life insurances and things like that. And that's what families need to look at as well. And in fact, if you even think about it, that's a very practical service that somebody in a ward could do, is to go over and talk to somebody if they happen to be in the financial area and say, let's look at this special needs thing and see what the implications really are. Because the earlier you can start planning, the better the outcomes are going to be for the family. So those are some of the practical things that a congregation could do.
So that's one of the big challenges, is figuring out, and it changes, like you said, day to day, what you will leave for Madison.
Yeah, because there have been times in his life where he has been so frustrated that literally he has pulled handfuls of hair out of his head. And he's had challenges it was near the end of high school, because you knew that he felt some very deep and real things. I don't think that's going to be a behavior that he'll repeat, but there may be some other types of things. But who will be there to address that, and to address that in compassion?
I think one of the things I maybe said in Greg's interview that was most offensive to some that were paying attention was just this sort of devil's advocate, naive sort of question of, well, if he doesn't have a verbal vocabulary, if he's in a home versus staying with you, would he even notice? And of course,
oh my gosh.
And I don't mean that as an offensive question.
No.
You sort of addressed it when your mother passed away. He obviously knew. Mm-hmm. But who's taking care of him, he must be very sensitive to.
And in some ways, Madison is very smart, and in some ways, he's oblivious to certain types of things. But reword that again. Just
so he's. I'm asking you to describe the extent to which he's very aware of who he's with and who's taking care of him, and what it would be like for him to have a major disruption.
I think that, continuity is a huge component, and I think very often people tend to look at people maybe in wheelchairs and say, "You're in a wheelchair, so thus you can't speak." And somebody may go into a restaurant and turn to the person that is with the individual in the wheelchair and say, "Well, what would they like?" Because sometimes people assume that because there is a disability that there isn't an intellectual capacity. And it is surprising how much more people can accomplish with disabilities than people often give them credit for. And I think we need to really be aware of that, because people feel the pain, they feel the neglect, they feel the yearnings. There are all of these things
Including cognitively impaired, profoundly cognitively impaired individuals.
Yes.
Still have a sense of people, of relationship, of environment, of care, of emotional needs even.
I had a person tell me about their sister who the family had been told to institutionalize as an infant because I guess there had been a lot of brain damage. And they said, just put her in an institution and walk away so you can have a normal life. And this person found out that there was a sister in their life when they were in their 20s and started a relationship with a sister, and nobody else in the family ever had. And she started to understand the things that the sister liked to do and wanted to do and found joy in doing because she was there, and she was there in the moment. And this person that had been totally written off by the rest of the family, this sister could see what she needed and what she wanted and was able to provide that until the sister passed away. So there is a lot more there than most people realize, and it is going to be with the individual, and if there's different types of learning disabilities. And with autism, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is a lack of cognitive things. Now, there can be comorbidities. It's like if you have a broken leg, does it mean you can't have a broken arm? Yeah, you can have two things happening at once. And so sometimes with individuals with autism, that's the case. Sometimes there are some cognitive things. Some, you have to look at the individual, much to the point that you brought up in the beginning.
So to close this second segment of the interview, if you had to kind of summarize your reflections on Madison, who he is, who he's been, what he's meant for you and your family, and some final remarks just about Madison personally, how would you kind of, how would you even attempt to try and distill what Madison has meant to you and to your family?
I will mention something in a way, and I want to be very clear about this. I don't feel that anybody is ever given a challenge, a physical challenge, an accident or whatever, to teach somebody else a lesson. No, that's not part of my theology. I need to learn a lesson, so you're going to suffer. No. With that being put aside, I do see that there have been some incredible things happen within our family. I see his sister and brother both as extremely compassionate, caring people that see the world a little bit differently, more because of the autism and who Madison is and potential. And they're just compassionate, caring, good people. Many of their friends, although they've got some cool friends, they've picked cool friends, but many people their age don't have the wisdom that these two individuals do, and I think Madison helps shape that. That was a fringe benefit to go along with all of the challenges, because there's been the parties that weren't held. There were the sleepovers that weren't had. There were the family trips that weren't taken. There was the silence that was broken. There were a number of things. It shaped our family, and it's really shaped my life in the last 10 years, because we took on this idea. We'd started with the idea of maybe doing a school for autism, and we were guided by a national and statewide and local investigation to see that working with the adult autism population, it is one of the most difficult things I've ever taken on in my life. If it hadn't been for Madison, there's no way in the world I would be in this arena. But it has shaped me. I hope I have helped shape others. So Madison has had a broad reach within our family and teaching us more about the complexities, about how there's often more than one solution, and that if there is a challenge in your world, and if God has given you the opportunities and has made available certain resources, that maybe there's an obligation not only in helping yourself, but seeing if you can put the oxygen mask on someone else. And he's opened up a lot of doors by just who he happens to be. And my hope for him is that he will be the best Madison that he can be. But I hope our daughter is the best Lauren she can be, and that his brother can be the best Chad that he can be. And we all have our different challenges, and that's what I hope for him, and that's what I hope the future would bring. And those are the contributions that Madison has made. He's having an indirect impact across the country and even in some other countries.
Beautiful.